sign here, move in Friday, and be gone by the end of November. The agreement was 9 pages. The part that changed everything was buried in Clause 4. I almost didn't read it. I had paint on my hands and a daughter waiting at her grandmother's place on Dunbar Street, and the woman sitting across from me in that glass office didn't look like she wanted small talk. She looked like she wanted the pen back. Her name was Diane Sutherland. I know that sounds like a character from a CBC drama, but it wasn't. She was real, she was 43, and she was the kind of person who had a separate refrigerator just for sparkling water. My name is Ray Kowalski. I'm 41. I do residential renos and drywall finishing, mostly in East Van and Burnaby. I drive a 2009 Ford Transit with a cracked passenger mirror and a heating system that takes 12 minutes to kick in. I have a daughter named Sophie who is 8, and who refuses to sleep without a stuffed rabbit named Mr. Buttons, and I've been raising her alone since she was 3, when her mother decided that the life we had wasn't the life she wanted. No hard feelings now. A lot of hard feelings then. I was not the kind of man who gets called to offices like Diane Sutherland's. Her assistant had reached out through my business email, the one I barely checked, about a renovation project in her home in West Vancouver. The house was a 1960s post and beam on a cliff above the water. I'd done work in that neighborhood before, mostly for people who referred to their kitchen as the chef's space. I knew how to talk to those clients. I knew how to quote the job, stay out of the way, and leave the floors cleaner than I found them. But when I got to the office, there was no project brief waiting, just Diane, 2 glasses of water, still not sparkling, and that 9-page document sitting on the glass table like a dare. She explained it quickly, the way people explain things when they've already decided the answer is yes. Her board of directors had inserted a clause into her CEO contract 2 years ago, a stability clause, she called it. The company, a mid-size pharmaceutical logistics firm with offices in Vancouver, Calgary, and Halifax, had been through 3 leadership changes in 5 years, and the board wanted continuity, wanted to signal to investors that the person at the top wasn't going anywhere, wasn't distracted, was settled. Someone had decided settled meant married, or at minimum, cohabitating with a long-term partner. The clause wasn't legally binding in a strict sense, but violating it opened a window for the board to trigger a performance review and restructure her contract. She'd seen them use smaller pretexts than that. She didn't need a husband. She needed someone credible in a house for 5 months. You'd live in the guest suite, she said. Your daughter is welcome if you need her there on school nights. You'd be paid $10,000 a month, plus your regular rate for the renovation work, because the house does need work, and I'd rather have someone competent than someone performing. I looked at Clause 4. The occupying party agrees to conduct themselves with discretion in all social contexts, to attend no fewer than 4 shared household events per month, and to refrain from discussing the nature of the arrangement with any third party for a period of no less than 18 months following the agreement's conclusion. I set the pen down. Why me? I said. She picked up her water glass. Because you're not in my world, you have no reason to talk, and your references describe you as someone who shows up on time and doesn't make things complicated. I thought about that for a moment. I have a daughter, I said. Sophie, 8 years old, attends Renfrew Elementary, likes rabbits. I didn't ask how she knew that. I assumed she had people whose job it was to know things before she walked into a room. She can't know, I said. Of course not. And I keep working, other clients, other jobs. I'd prefer that. I drove back across the bridge and sat in the Tim Hortons on Hastings for 40 minutes, with a medium coffee going cold in front of me. I called my mother, who had Sophie that afternoon. I didn't tell her what I was considering. I told her I had a big job offer in West Van and I was thinking it over. She said, Raymond, when someone in West Van offers you money, you say yes and you figure out the details later. She's been giving me advice like that my whole life, and she's been right about 60% of the time. I called Diane back at 7 that evening. She picked up on the second ring. I said yes. Moving into that house felt like putting on someone else's coat. Everything fit, technically. The guest suite was bigger than the main floor of the place Sophie and I rented on Nanaimo. The bed had a headboard that cost more than my truck. The shower had a built-in bench and a rainfall head and little bottles of products I didn't recognize, arranged in a straight line by someone who clearly had opinions about straight lines. Sophie came the first Friday, rolling her backpack in through the front door and stopping in the entryway the way kids stop when something genuinely surprises them, mouth just slightly open, eyes moving fast. "Is this a hotel?" she said. "It's where we're staying for a while," I said. "It smells like a hotel." Diane was in the kitchen. She'd been on a call and she'd barely looked up when we came in. Sophie walked into the kitchen the way she walks into every room, like she has every right to be there, and looked at Diane with that flat, measuring stare she gets. "Are you the lady who owns this house?" Sophie said. Diane set her phone down. "Yes." "Do you have a dog?" "No." "Why not?" There was a pause. I watched Diane's face go through something small. Not quite a smile, not quite annoyance. Something that was deciding which one it wanted to be. "I travel a lot," Diane said. Sophie considered this. "Mr. Buttons is a rabbit, but he's not real. He's stuffed. I could show you if you want." Diane said, "Maybe later," and went back to her call. That night I put Sophie to bed in the guest room and stood in the hallway outside the door for a while, listening to the water and the dark through the big windows, and thought about how strange it was to be standing in a house that wasn't mine, with a kid who was everything I had in the world, and a woman down the hall who had everything but didn't seem to feel it. I started on the laundry room the second week, tile work, new fixtures, replacing the water-damaged subfloor behind the washing machine, work I knew, work that made sense in my hands. Diane moved through the house the way some people move through airports, efficiently, without looking at much, already thinking about the next thing. She left early. She came back late. She said good morning when she passed the kitchen and thank you when I finished a section, and that was usually the whole of it. The first real conversation we had was about a shelf. She'd come home at 9, which was early for her, and I was still in the laundry room finishing up the trim. She stood in the doorway and looked at the work. "You mitered those corners," she said. "It looks better." The last contractor butt-jointed everything. I could tell when I pulled the old trim. He was rushing. She leaned against the doorframe. She was still in her work clothes, a dark blazer, no jewelry except small gold earrings, and she looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Go ahead. What do you actually think of this, the arrangement?" I set down my nail gun. I looked at her. "I think you're solving a real problem with a strange solution," I said. "But I've done stranger things for less money, and at least the work here is honest." She was quiet for a moment. "The work," she said. "Renovation," I said. "The tile, the floors, that part is honest." She made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. Then she went down the hall, and I finished the trim, and I didn't think much more about it. 50. But the next evening she was in the kitchen when I came in from the cold, and she'd made coffee. Not for me. She'd just made too much, and she pushed a mug across the counter without being asked. And I sat down on the stool on the other side, and we didn't really talk, but we were both there. And it was different from the nights before. There was a Friday in October when Sophie didn't want to go to my mother's because there was a school project due Monday, and she wanted to stay in the hotel house, as she'd taken to calling it, where the table was big enough to spread everything out. Diane came home that afternoon to Sophie on the living room floor, surrounded by poster board, markers, and a pile of printed photographs about the life cycle of Pacific salmon. Sophie looked up at her. "I'm doing a project." "I can see that." "Did you know salmon swim back to the exact river they were born in?" "I did know that." "How did they figure that out?" Diane sat down on the floor. She was still in her work clothes. She sat cross-legged on the hardwood beside a 7-year-old salmon project and said, "They tagged them, put a little marker on them and tracked where they went." "That's so sad," Sophie said. "Why?" "Because they never get to go somewhere new. They just have to go back." Diane was quiet for a second. I was at the kitchen counter cutting vegetables and pretending not to watch. "Maybe they like going back," Diane said. "Do you?" Sophie said. Diane looked at her. "I'm not sure I have a back to go to." Sophie accepted this the way kids accept things that are too big to understand. She just nodded and went back to her marker and said, "Do you want to help me label the estuary part?" And Diane said yes. I cut vegetables for 20 minutes and didn't say anything. I didn't need to. There was an event in mid-October, one of the 4 the clause required. A dinner at a colleague's home in Dunderov, 8 people around a table, the kind of dinner where the wine is described before it's poured, and everyone has a careful opinion about things that happened in the news. I wore the one jacket I own that isn't work-related, a dark wool thing I bought for my cousin's wedding in Kelowna 3 years ago. It still fit. Diane's colleagues were polite to me in the way that people are polite when they're trying to figure out where you fit. I told them I did residential renovations. One of them said, "Oh, we've been looking for a good contractor," which is what people in that tax bracket always say when they find out what I do. I gave him my card. He lost it, I'm sure, but I gave it to him. At one point, the host asked how Diane and I met. I started to answer, but Diane spoke first. "He was renovating a property on the North Shore," she said. I walked through it with my realtor. He was the only person in the building not trying to impress me. That was true. It wasn't the truth. It had nothing to do with how we actually came to be in the same house, but it was true in the way that the most convincing lies always are. They borrow from something real. I looked at her when she said it. She didn't look back. On the drive home along Marine Drive, the water black and the lights of the city across the inlet, she said, "You didn't correct me." It wasn't worth correcting. Most people would have hesitated. "I've done a lot of jobs where the whole point is not to disrupt anything," I said. "You learn to read a room." She looked out the window. "What did you think of them?" "Nice people," I said. "Careful people." "Is that a criticism?" "It's an observation." She turned back to look at me. She had her hands folded in her lap, and she was studying me the way she studied her water glass sometimes, like she was trying to determine the weight of it. "You don't want anything from me," she said, "do you?" It wasn't really a question. "I want the job finished right," I said, "and I want Sophie to have a good fall." She turned back to the window. "That's the most uncomplicated thing anyone has said to me in about 4 years," she said. 150. Her name is Patrice, and she lives in Thunder Bay, and we talk every few weeks and usually about nothing. The weather, her kids, whatever hockey team I've given up on this season. But this time she called because she was going through our dad's things. He'd passed in the spring, and she'd been the one to handle the estate because I couldn't take the time off, and I'd felt guilty about that since March in a way I hadn't figured out how to say out loud. She'd found his old level, the long aluminum one he'd used his whole career, 40 years of construction work up in the north. My name was taped to the back of it in his handwriting, for Ray. The tape had yellowed, but the letters were still clear. I went to the bathroom so Sophie wouldn't see. I sat on the edge of the tub and held my phone and didn't talk for a while. When I came out, Diane was in the hallway. She must have heard something or noticed something, because she didn't say anything clever or ask what was wrong. She just stood there. "My dad left me his level," I said. It sounded stupid out loud. "He passed this spring. We didn't talk much the last few years, but he left me his level." She didn't say I'm sorry or offer something I didn't need. She said, "Is he the one who taught you to do this work?" "Yeah." Then he knew what it was worth. I stood there a minute. Then I went back to the kitchen and finished cleaning up the dinner dishes, and she went back to her office, and Sophie slept through all of it with Mr. Buttons tucked under her chin. And it was fine. It was enough. Diane's board meeting was the second week of November. She'd been preparing for it for a month. Documents, calls, late nights with her laptop at the kitchen table. I didn't ask questions. I kept working on the upstairs bathroom. I left coffee outside her office door when I heard her still on calls past 10. One morning she came into the kitchen, looking like she hadn't slept, which she probably hadn't, and she stood at the counter and said, "They're pushing for a Q1 expansion into Ontario, and I think it's going to blow the Eastern distribution margin." I poured her a coffee. "What does your gut say?" I asked. She looked at me. "About Ontario?" "About the decision." She wrapped her hands around the mug, that they're moving fast because they're scared of someone else moving first. And scared decisions are usually wrong. "So you're going to say that in the meeting?" "I'm going to say it in language they'll accept." "Is that different?" She looked at me for a moment. "Yes, but it shouldn't be." I went back upstairs to the bathroom. Later that day she sent me a text that said only, "The Ontario motion was tabled. Thank you for the coffee." I wasn't sure what the coffee had to do with it, but I kept the message. November 30 was the last day of the agreement. I knew it, she knew it, nobody had said it out loud in weeks. I'd finished the laundry room, the upstairs bathroom, half the kitchen cabinet work, and the water-damaged section of the deck off the main bedroom. The house looked different than it did when I arrived. Better, I think. Not just the work, something in the way it sat. Sophie had a performance at school the afternoon of the 30th. She was playing the back half of a reindeer in a winter pageant that had been carefully renamed to avoid any religious connotations, which Sophie found hilarious. I told Diane about it the week before, mostly just as information. I wasn't expecting anything. Diane came. She drove herself. She sat in the gymnasium on a folding chair beside me and watched 23 children perform an 11-minute production in which the front half of the reindeer and the back half faced different directions for most of the second act. When Sophie emerged from the costume afterward, face flushed and grinning, she looked out at the audience and found us both. Her face went through something I don't have good words for, something that looked a lot like, "Oh, you're both here." In the parking lot after, Sophie took Diane's hand. Just grabbed it, the way kids do, without ceremony or explanation, as though it was simply the obvious thing to do because they were walking in the same direction and hands are for holding. Diane looked down, then she looked at me. I didn't say anything. Sophie was already pulling her toward the van and talking about the reindeer logistics, explaining very seriously why the staging was flawed, and Diane was nodding like she agreed, which she probably did. I packed the transit on the morning of December 1st. Not all of it, some of Sophie's things, most of my tools. I left the good coffee in the kitchen because it wasn't mine and I'd been using it for 2 months. I was loading the last of the drill cases when Diane came outside without a coat, in the cold, hands wrapped around her own elbows. "The cabinet work," she said. "I'll refer you to someone good." "I don't want someone good. I want the person who knows where it's going." I closed the van door. She looked at the driveway. She looked at the water. "I don't know how to do this," she said. It came out quietly, like something she'd been practicing and decided at the last moment to just say plainly instead. "Do what?" "Ask someone to stay without making it a transaction." I waited. "Sophie likes the salmon estuary table," she said, which made no sense, except it made complete sense, because it meant the living room and the floor project and the Friday afternoon in October, and none of those things were in the 9 pages. "Is that what you're saying?" I said. "I'm saying the work isn't finished." She paused, "and I'm saying I'd like it not to be." The inlet was flat and silver behind her. Somewhere down the street a crow was complaining about something. I'd been in this city my whole life, and it still surprised me sometimes how much you could say with the weather just sitting there around you. I picked up my last drill case and put it back in the house. I didn't say anything grand. I just set it down by the door and went back out to get the coffee I'd left in the kitchen, because it was cold out, and the drive to my mother's to get Sophie was 40 minutes and I was going to need it. She held the door open for me when I came back. That was enough. That was everything, really. Some things you can't put in a clause. The committee that drafted those 9 pages knew a lot about liability and continuity and investor confidence. They didn't know anything about a man standing in a driveway in December with a drill case in his hand, deciding whether the life he already had was something he wanted to complicate. It turned out it was. My dad's level arrived from Thunder Bay the following week. Patrice had wrapped it in 2 layers of bubble wrap and a note that said, "Don't let it sit in the truck." I put it in the new laundry room on the shelf I'd built, where the tile met the wall at exactly the angle it was supposed to. Sophie asked me what it was. I told her it was a tool for making sure things were even. She said, "Like fair?" I said, "Yeah, like fair." 50. She went back to whatever she was drawing, and I stood there for a minute with my hand on my father's level in a house that had started to feel, quietly and without announcement, like somewhere I was allowed to be. I keep thinking about that level, the one my dad taped my name to years before he died without ever telling me it was there. 150. He wasn't a man who said things out loud. He showed up, he did the work, he made sure the measurements were right. That was his whole philosophy, as far as I could tell, and for most of my adult life I thought that was a limitation, something he couldn't help, something that made him hard to reach. I understand it better now. Some people tell you who they are through what they leave behind, not what they say while they're standing in front of you. I think about that when I think about what happened with Diane. Not the agreement, not the 9 pages, not the clause that started all of it. I think about the version of myself that walked into that glass office in September and almost said no. The version of me that had gotten very good at keeping things manageable. A tight radius. Work, Sophie, my mother's place on Sundays, the same Tim Hortons on Hastings. I wasn't unhappy, I was just careful. And careful, after a while, starts to look a lot like small. What I didn't understand then, what I had to live my way into understanding, is that integrity isn't just about refusing the wrong things. It's about being honest enough with yourself to recognize when you've been using caution as a substitute for courage. I turned down the money Diane offered when she wanted to put Sophie in a private school. I turned it down because it felt like a transaction, like something that would cost me more than it gave. That was the right call. But staying in that house when the agreement ended, putting the drill case back inside the door, that took something different. That took being willing to want something and admit it, out loud, in the cold, with nothing guaranteed. Sophie grabbed Diane's hand in that parking lot without thinking about it. Kids do that. They don't calculate. They just reach for what feels right and trust that it'll hold. I've spent a lot of years thinking that kind of trust was something you had to earn your way back to, after enough things went sideways. But watching Sophie, I started to think maybe it was something you just had to decide to stop talking yourself out of. The hard part isn't the bad days. I've had bad days. The years after Sophie's mother left, the spring my dad died, the nights I sat in the truck outside the school trying to figure out if I was doing any of this right. The hard part is the quiet accumulation of good days, and whether you let yourself believe they're real, or whether you keep one hand on the door just in case. I put my dad's level on the shelf I built in that laundry room. It's still there. I check it sometimes. Not because anything needs adjusting, but because it's his, and because there's something steadying about a tool that only tells you the truth. That's what I want Sophie to understand someday, when she's old enough to hear it. That the people worth trusting are the ones who don't make themselves bigger than they are. That real intelligence isn't just about knowing the right answer, it's about being honest about what you don't know, and staying curious anyway. And that resilience isn't the absence of hard times, it's just what's left in you after the hard times if you haven't spent it all on bitterness. We didn't have a plan. We still don't. Not really. We just have a house on a cliff above the water, a kid who talks to salmon charts like they're old friends, and a shelf with an old aluminum level on it that somebody's father left behind as proof that the work matters, even when no one is watching. That's enough. Most days, that's everything.